Hello, my name is Father Kevin Flannery. I'm a Jesuit. I teach at the Jesuit University in Rome, the Pontifical Gregorian University, and I teach their ancient philosophy, primarily the philosophy of Aristotle. Also, occasionally saying something in my teaching about Thomas Aquinas, and in fact, I'll say a good deal about both these figures in these lessons today. The lessons for these videos are 2 in number. As you know, there are 5 written lessons. What I've done for these video lessons is I've left off the first and the last of the written lessons, and I'll look at primarily the ideas contained in the middle 3 lessons. And in fact, this first lesson will have primarily to do, and in fact solely to do, with what we find in the second written lesson. And the second video lesson will be a combination of things that we find in the third and fourth written lessons. Those 2 lessons are about the ethics of sexuality and reproduction, and the fourth one is about the ethics of killing, or letting live also. One word about what I hope to accomplish in these video lessons, and in fact in all the lessons. I would hope that by means of these lessons that you might come to understand how ethics works from the inside. I'll be talking a good deal about intelligibility, about reason, and I very much hope that together we can achieve some sort of grasp of the very reasonability of ethics. In that way, when you come across, either in your reading or also in your personal lives, some ethical problem, some issue you need to solve, you'll have the equipment to solve those questions. I might also mention that some of the examples that I use are a bit controversial. I'll talk about war. I'll talk about the use of condoms in certain circumstances. These controversial examples I find are useful. They focus the mind. They help us to understand, in fact, the reasons behind certain ethical judgments that the Church has come up with, and they force us to use our own reasons so that we can grasp the intelligibility of these actions, these types of actions. So then, to begin with what is the topic of this first video lecture, that is the nature of human action itself. Hamlet, in the famous play of Shakespeare, says that there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. He had something quite different in mind when he said that. He was talking, in fact, about Denmark, whether it was a good place or a bad place. And yet, as so often in Shakespeare, these words from Hamlet, spoken by Hamlet, tell us a great deal about the human situation. And the fact is that ethics is simply about what is rational, what is intelligible. That is, everything in ethics comes from and depends on rationality. This theme was mentioned several times in Dr. McInerney's first lectures, in which he talked about the importance of reason for Christian faith. In many ways, this is simply a continuation of that idea. I've used the word intelligibility a number of times, and so perhaps it would be good to say something about that word. And what it means basically is simply understandability. Anything that we can understand, anything that has even a minimum of intellectual content can be described as intelligible. The idea basically comes from Aristotle, but also Thomas, who obviously, as you know, I'm sure they did a good deal of work in logic and work in the work on the intelligibility of stringing words together. In fact, one of the best examples to use for the intelligible, for understanding things, or for understanding what intelligibility is language itself. A language that is a general language, a language understood in a general sense, is something that can be understood. It's a mass of propositions, sentences, words, etc. And if we had a perfectly intelligible language in which all the sentences uttered were well-formed and reasonable sentences, then you would have a whole language, even a whole culture, which was perfectly intelligible. Obviously, that's not something which presents itself in this world. But let's speak a bit just about smaller pieces of intelligibility. For instance, a sentence. A sentence which you find in the, well, in fact, it's not a sentence at all. A sentence which is mentioned in the written lectures is really just a string of words. And the string of words I chose is beer ad parses. Okay, what you have there are three words strung together as if they were a sentence, but in fact they don't make sense, they don't have intelligibility as a sentence, as a whole. However, they do, or that string of words, that string of three words does have intelligibility at the level of the words themselves. That is, the words beer, ad, and parses are all intelligible as they stand. The problem is simply that, that when we come up a level to the level of a sentence, that they don't make sense. So my point is simply that intelligibility can be either large in context or small in context, or in fact, something which purports to be a word, for instance, can lack intelligibility altogether. For instance, instead of using the word beer, that is B-E-E-R, we may just find the words B-R on the page, and then we have something which is not intelligible at all as a word. There are other things in the world which are also intelligible. Animals, for instance, that is, and in particular, the essences of animals. A rabbit, for instance, makes sense. It has a certain structure which we can grasp. A scientist can study rabbits and come to grasp its nature. And that's basically to grasp its reason, grasp its intelligibility. Also, groups of people can have a certain intelligibility. For instance, a marriage has a certain intelligibility, and it has more intelligibility the better it works. For intelligibility ultimately depends on having a point, it depends on getting towards something. So if a marriage is working well, all the parts in the marriage, all the events in a marriage, in a family, are going to come together in a reasonable, intelligible way that is reasonable given the points of having a marriage, of having a family. Another example that I'll use a number of times is an army. An army, too, has a structure. It's a very complex structure, a very complex body of people, but it has a particular point, that is victory in war, and it has various parts which are not always identical one with the other. It has various weapons, it has various other equipment, it has people, it has generals who are distinct from privates, et cetera, et cetera. So all these things can be described as intelligible. Any complex intelligible entity, especially in organization, can be assessed to determine just how well it fits together, how well it achieves its own intelligibility, that is, intelligibility as that type of thing. In a marriage, for instance, to come back to that example, you may have different parts in a marriage which are intelligible in themselves. For instance, it may be intelligible in itself for a person to be living in one city and his wife or her husband to be living in another city, and those are intelligible things to do. But it may not be a good thing for a marriage, for the intelligibility of a marriage, for its point, for those two people to be living separately. It's not always the case, but it can be the case. Let's come now, however, and we must come now to human actions themselves. And human actions, as I said, are intelligible. In many ways, a human action is an idea. It's important to realize, however, that actions, although they are ideas and they find their existence primarily in the intelligible, that is, in the intellectual, in our minds, as Hamlet said, there's nothing that's good or bad except our thinking makes it so. Although that is the case, actions are also about things. So actions do have reference. Their very intelligibility pertains to the physical. They're also quite difficult to grasp sometimes, that is an action. An example of a solid physical thing which has an intelligibility would be, for instance, a rifle, a weapon that a soldier uses in war. And he is taught at the beginning of his training to take it apart and to understand how all its various parts fit together. That is why we do that, why a soldier does that, in order to understand those parts. When we come to human actions, things are much more difficult, primarily because human actions don't sit still. Once an action is performed, it's gone. Nonetheless, there are ways in which we can organize our understanding, that is, our attempt to grasp the intelligibility of human actions. There are primarily two limiting factors for action. The first of these limiting factors is ignorance. In other words, if I'm ignorant of what I'm doing, then that's, which I do, at least in that aspect, cannot be a human action. So it's not a moral action for which I'm responsible. And also another limiting factor would be force. So if I'm actually forced to do something by someone else, to the extent that I am forced to do it, I'm not responsible for it. It's not a moral action. As Thomas Aquinas would say, it's not a human action. But once we get past those limiting issues, those limiting factors, and we look at actions which we acknowledge are genuine human actions, then there are three aspects that we have to look at. And these aspects are, in fact, mentioned in John Paul II's encyclical Veritatis Splendor. And these are the so-called sources of morality. The first of these sources is intention. The second is or are the circumstances of an act. And finally, the third is the object of the act. So we'll go through those three sources of morality in order. Intention. Thomas Aquinas uses an example which is very useful, and I'll mention a number of times during these lectures. He mentions the example of a thief who steals a golden cup from a temple. The example itself is taken from non-Christian, that is, pagan philosophy, but he uses it. And in fact, we can simply think of stealing a chalice from a church. And in this case, the action is an action which has a particular moral character, and that moral character is called sacrilege. It's a sacrilegious act. And we can well believe that a thief takes that chalice or that cup from the sacred place in order to desecrate that particular place, and that is his intention. I'll come to the other things later, obviously. Now, it's very important to realize that intention is not necessarily something that is entirely under our own control. That it's not the case, for instance, that if a person says to himself in his own mind, tells himself a story in his mind that I do not mean to desecrate this church, that is to commit sacrilege. It does not mean that in doing what he does, that is commit an act of sacrilege, that he is not intending, in fact, to commit sacrilege. Our intention is largely determined by what we know, and given that this person knows that this type of an act is sacrilege, then he is, in fact, intending to commit sacrilege, according to Thomas. So let us go on then to the second of the fonts or the sources of morality, and this is the object. In the sacrilege case, the case that we've been considering, the object is in fact the cup or the chalice. Or we may say that it's the cup or the chalice qua stealable, that is, as understandable, as intelligible as to be stolen, or possibly to be stolen. In Veritatis Splendor, the Holy Father says these words. He says, in order to be able to grasp the object of an act, which specifies that act morally, he says, it is necessary to place oneself in the perspective of the acting person. And at that point, he cites Thomas Aquinas. So again, it's very important that we realize that even an object, although it can be a physical object, is an object insofar as it's intelligible, insofar as we grasp what it is. However, it's very important. In fact, this is an issue which has upset a good number of theologians and philosophers, Catholic Christian theologians and philosophers in recent years. Although we're talking about things from the perspective of the acting person, as the Holy Father says, that doesn't exclude the physical. Thomas Aquinas, in the very section that the Pope quotes, is very clear about that, saying quite explicitly that the object of an act, although intelligible, is a thing. It can, or at least it can be, a physical thing. A good example of this, and this is, as I said, perhaps a controversial example, is the use of condoms or prophylactics. And the cases where it often comes up is in the case of the prevention of AIDS. And the issue is that, well, it's possible to, in fact, use a prophylactic simply in order to prevent disease. And the argument being that we can't take into consideration the physical characteristics of something, that is, that there is a prophylactic being used in a moral argument. But that type of argument does not wash, at least if you're following Thomas Aquinas and, in fact, Aristotle, because the physical can, in fact, enter in. So let's move on now to the third of the sources of morality, that is circumstances. And the circumstances, the list of circumstances that Thomas Aquinas uses is taken from Aristotle, but also from Cicero. It's a sort of combined list from both authors. And the list, the standard classical list is who, what, where, by what means, why, how, and when, and, according to Cicero, about what. To use the example that we have been using, that is of the cup in the temple, we've already talked about the about the object, so the object is the cup itself, the fact that that cup is in a temple is a circumstance, and also the intention, at least according to Thomas Aquinas, also Aristotle, is a circumstance. It's a circumstance insofar it doesn't belong to the basic act that the thief is performing. It's not in the very essence of the act, that is, that which is right before him. What's important and a bit difficult to understand about circumstances is that sometimes they can enter into the very nature of the thing that a person is doing and sometimes not. And for instance, if I steal a car, let's say I steal your car, it makes no difference whether your car, when I steal it, is on this street or that street. And so that circumstance doesn't come into the very nature of the act that you're doing. But in the case of sacrilege, the fact that this cup is actually in the temple or in the church, that changes completely the nature of the act. So circumstances occasionally come in, or actually fairly frequently come in and give you the very nature of the act, and they become very, very important morally. The question is obviously, well, how do we decide when a circumstance has this sort of moral significance? And the answer is simply that we must look to the intelligibility. We must look to what reason says about such acts. And reason, that is over the centuries, reason as it comes to us through the teachings of the church, but also in the laws of a society, basically in natural law, reason says that it is not a good thing to desecrate a holy place. So those are the three fonts, the three sources of morality. I'd like to finish just by talking about one of the two limiting factors that I mentioned earlier. I mentioned two of them, you'll recall. The first of them is simply ignorance. So in other words, if you're ignorant of something, well then you're not responsible for it. In fact, we've already been talking about ignorance. Okay, so if, for instance, a person doesn't realize that the building from which he takes the chalice is, or the cup is, a temple or is a church, well then he can't commit sacrilege. And so anyhow, ignorance is something which is always in the background as limiting what comes into the realm of the moral. But the other issue, the other limiting factor, is force. The standard line in Aristotle, or the classical definition of Aristotle, which comes in the third book of the Nicomachean Ethics, is that of which the initiative is outside the agent, that is the acting person, that is the person involved contributes nothing to it. So that's the standard definition of force, exonerating force. An example, in fact, it's an example which is often used in the literature, and it's an example taken from ancient philosophy, is in fact from Aristotle, is the example of a person being pushed onto a catapult, which triggers, and the catapult kills a friend of the person who's pushed onto the catapult. Well, in that case, the person, although in a sense he's the agent of that action, of the killing, it's not his moral action because he's been forced. Okay, so that's the standard example of force, or a standard example. It's my own opinion, but it's an opinion which is based on especially Aristotle and also Thomas, that we can extend that notion of force to take in some other issues. That is, to analyze how anything that does not depend on the agent's own initiative can be excluded from the moral realm. That is, he's not responsible for this. I'll just use, to close, it's an example which is a standard example in modern bioethics. And again, it's a bit controversial. It's not controversial in terms of doctrine, but controversial or in the sense that people may not immediately agree with it. But anyhow, this is the example, and it may help to bring out the distinction, is that the church, in fact, at the end of the 19th century, said that it's immoral for a doctor to actually attack a fetus in the womb in order to help the woman, that is the fetus's mother, to live, given that that woman could not live if that fetus continued to live. And so anyhow, the church said that couldn't be done. So to change the example a bit, because they didn't have this technology then, but if you can imagine that a woman has to give birth, but giving birth will kill her, a possible solution would be simply to dissolve the fetus by means of chemicals. And the church said very clearly that is not to be done. It's an immoral act because it's direct killing. In fact, the object of that act is the fetus. But there's another example which is often used among Catholic moralists, among not only Catholic moralists, and that's the example of a woman who needs to have a hysterectomy because her uterus is cancerous, and she also happens to be pregnant. And if the situation is such that the operation for the cancer is genuinely forced upon the doctor and upon the woman, it is possible to perform the hysterectomy, that is possible morally to perform that hysterectomy, even though the fetus is going to die during the operation. And the reason for this, that is the reason for the distinction between these two things, is precisely that hysterectomy as a practice belongs to medicine, but medicine understood in the sense of a practice that is an organization of actions, etc., which is well organized, and not only well organized, but intelligible, and intelligible in the sense that it fits, it does not violate any moral precepts. For instance, it doesn't violate the precept of against direct attacks against innocence. The application of the notion of force here is simply the fact that when the doctor comes to that operation, the fact that hysterectomy is an accepted operation, an accepted practice of medicine, has nothing to do with his own decision. That is something that comes with the medical profession itself. And therefore, that type of an act can be performed because the death of the fetus is outside of that very, very fixed practice. So these are, as I said in this first lesson, my hope was to delve into the very intelligibility, the very essence of ethics, and that is moral action, in order that we might be able to derive some principles from some examples, some controversial examples, and in fact some examples that we'll continue to use in the second video lesson. Thank you.